Welcome also from my side to this masterclass series. This is an event organized by the Corporate Strategy Interest Group at SMS, and it's great to have so many people join us here today, not only from the Corporate Strategy Interest Group, but also from other interest groups. We've actually been doing this event for a while now. As Janae has mentioned, there are even recordings available for the past master classes that have been led by other speakers, and you can see an overview here, and you'll find the recordings on YouTube and the SMS member circle. Today, we have an exciting masterclass dealing with past, present, and future research at the intersection of corporate and competitive strategy. And let me also say that you should stay tuned for our future masterclasses. So for example, we have Ron Adner and Deepak Samaya, who are also in the audience today here. They will lead a masterclass on the demand side view of corporate strategy. So there are definitely always new things to look out for and to stay tuned for. So today's masterclass has been organized by myself and Lisa Tang, who is also in the audience here today. And we have these terrific speakers that probably don't even need an introduction, but let me still very briefly introduce them to you in case you haven't met them. Definitely very nice and successful scholars in the field. We have Javier Gimeno, who is at INSEAD. His research focuses on understanding competitive strategy decisions and how these decisions lead to competitive interactions and performance consequences. He has studied multi-market competition extensively, and I think we'll also talk about this today, especially also in industries such as the airline industry. We also have Marvin Lieberman, who's at UCLA. Marvin's research focuses on issues relating to firm-level productivity and performance comparisons. Most of you will probably also be familiar with his work on the first mover advantage. So as you can see, two scholars extremely well equipped to guide us through an exciting and extremely informative masterclass here today. And as Janae already said, we'll have around 20 minutes of a presentation for each speaker, and then basically continue with a Q&A at the end of the session. And for that Q&A session, I think it would be extremely helpful to everyone if you could just start posting your questions during the presentations already, and we'll then pick them up during the Q&A session and hopefully answer as many as possible. So without any further ado, Marvin, I'm really looking forward to this. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Let me just start my stopwatch here so I don't go over. Teresa, thank you for inviting me. You and Lisa, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thanks to all of you who are in the audience. Let me try sharing my screen. I'm going first because Javier just got out of a class a few minutes ago. I'll give him a chance to catch his breath. Can you see my slides? Can you hear me? Everything good? All right. So we're going to talk about the intersection of corporate strategy and competitive strategy. And obviously, I'm not a first mover here. There have been many presentations in this corporate strategy masterclass. I was trying to figure out what I could do that wouldn't overlap too much with what was already presented. A lot of these master classes do touch on this intersection. And I decided, since I've been in this field now for over 40 years, that I would give my somewhat idiosyncratic view of how our understanding of the intersection has evolved since the 1980s. And the prior master classes that are most relevant here, the evolution of corporate strategy with Connie Helfet and David Teese, mergers and acquisitions with Laurence Capron and Melissa Graebner, divestments with Emily Feldman and Asim Kaul, strategic redeployment with Tim Folta and Brian Wu, and strategic renewal with Connie Helfet and Dan Leventhal. So now I think I know what competitive strategy is and what corporate strategy is, but just to make sure, I went to the SMS website, to the listings under the IGs, and competitive strategy is, according to that listing, about questions concerning firms and their interactions within product and factor markets over time. How do businesses interact? What is competitive advantage? A question I've been wondering about myself. Resources and capabilities and their role in shaping firms and industries over time. Whereas corporate strategy is really about the scope of the firm, uh, basically changing an organization's portfolio of business lines, specific issues of vertical integration, mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, corporate diversification, and so on. Now, these were really, I think, quite distinct back in 1980, but perhaps less so today. In fact, Teresa told me before we started that there was a question that came in advance in capital letters saying, is competitive strategy an outdated concept? Uh, Now, I've always considered myself a competitive strategy person and kind of an interloper on the corporate strategy side. But as I put this talk together, I realized that things have really shifted, that the critical mass here uh, has moved, I think, in many ways from competitive strategy to corporate strategy. And there is some question about what is competitive strategy about in a kind of an independent way from corporate strategy. So I'll touch on that a little bit. Let me begin. I was a doctoral student. Mike Porter was one of my advisors back in the late 70s, early 80s. And Mike published an article in HBR in 1987 called From Competitive Advantage to Corporate Strategy. And he in that article showed that most acquisitions are ultimately divested, something that maybe seems surprising at the time. I think we all recognize that today. And Mike wrote, moving from competitive strategy to corporate strategy is the business equivalent of passing through the Bermuda Triangle. Now, the Bermuda Triangle is this area of ocean where ships mysteriously sink and airplanes mysteriously crash. And what Mike was saying here is that managers have good intentions to move from competitive strategy to corporate strategy with their businesses, but as they launch their ships, a lot of them end up mysteriously sinking into the ocean. Now, this Bermuda Triangle, I think we recognize today, encompasses a wider range of strategic forces than what was perceived in the 1980s. I'll talk about this in a minute. And in general, today we think about this intersection as embracing much more of a dynamic set of forces, embracing much more uncertainty and complexity. Now, this is really the key slide in terms of the organization of what I'm going to talk about, going from this static conception from the 1980s to the dynamic conception that we have today. Back in the 1980s, we thought of corporate strategy as being really about economies of scope, complementarities on the supply side at a specific point in time. There's a lot of work on relatedness and fit. Dick Vermelt had his famous book on relatedness. Nikolai Sigelkow, one of Mike Porter's students, had his dissertation and work on fit. Cynthia Montgomery had important contributions. There's a lot of really great work on sharing of resources, also core competence. But I think this work ultimately, we solved the problem. We understood what this sharing was about, at least in this limited kind of way. And by the time we got to the 1990s, I think corporate strategy was starting to become a little bit of a backwater. Now, Mike Porter told me as a student that corporate strategy is the icing on the cake. Now, the cake, which was business strategy or competitive strategy, Mike regarded as being the really important thing. And you could add a little bit of extra superior return with this icing of corporate strategy. So I think Mike's perspective, and certainly my perspective early on, was that competitive strategy was really the important thing, and then corporate strategy could add a little bit. This is also kind of a static conception. If you think about the cake is baked, it's done. It sits there. Sure, you might swap out a layer or two, as things change, or if your acquisition didn't work out. But basically, the cake is there, done and baked at a point in time. Whereas today, we have this much more dynamic conception, viewing the firm as I would say, an evolving organic system. And I'll talk about all the elements, the research areas are listed on the right specifically in just a minute: dynamic capabilities, exploration and exploitation, resource redeployment, acquisition and divestiture, uncertainty and real options, business life cycles, platforms and ecosystems. I mean, all of these have been active research areas in essentially corporate strategy, and they together have made corporate strategy really the very exciting place that it is today. Anyway, putting this together, I realized how dated my conception, which is based on this icing on the cake idea that Porter put in my ear, how out of date that is today. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, let me say a little bit about this icing on the cake metaphor. I think Porter told me that 80% of the returns, superior returns, come from the business strategy, either low cost or differentiation, and you could get it's maybe 20% additional return from the corporate strategy through these economies of scope and resource sharing and core competence. I'm sure he told me that if you have a poor business strategy, there's no way you can fix it through a good corporate strategy. And back in those days, this picture here comes from Rob Grant's strategy book, which I used to use. We had linkages between businesses, which you can think of as maybe the icing between the layers, and core competence, which you might think of as the icing that's on the top and maybe on the sides. So this cake and icing analogy, I think, made a lot of sense back in those days. But of course, we had this Bermuda Triangle problem that many managers, have this vision of the beautiful layer cake, but when they go through the Bermuda Triangle, a lot of things happen, and the result is nothing like the vision. And in our research, we now know there are many reasons why the results don't equal the vision. One is this role of uncertainty that's often overlooked. I think in those days, people said, yeah, I mean, there is uncertainty. You don't know if your acquisition is going to work. But uncertainty was not something to be embraced, to really be thought about proactively as something that can be used in thinking about corporate strategy. We had, in those days, I think certainly managers had a much poorer understanding of resources and capabilities. Now we distinguish between scale-free and non-scale-free resources. Leventhal and Wu had an important piece there. Poor implementation, lots of work on post-merger integration, other implementation issues, and of course the rise of dynamic capabilities is a major area in our field. It's also true that while the icing can enhance the cake, it also imposes costs and constraints. So it may actually make performance worse. A standalone cake is more flexible, more focused. So you always have to think about whether it makes sense to combine these businesses or leave them separate and more focused. Now, to say that corporate strategy became a backwater, kind of ran out of ideas in the 1990s is not quite right, because we did have the rise of transactions cost theory during that period, in making a lot of contributions in strategy. And transactions cost theory, of course, encompasses uncertainty. It's really, when you combine uncertainty and asset specificity in an environment with opportunism, you have the context for transactions cost theory. So that was, a major area of research that still continues, but I think it's also died back a little bit. Now, in addition to uncertainty, we have this issue of dynamics. To survive and thrive, firms must adapt to change. Change comes from many places, from changes in technology, changes in competition, changes in customer needs, the internal evolution of capabilities and constraints from the industry life cycle, excuse me, And I thought I'd show you, some of you remember this, this is what we gave to managers back in the 1980s as a way to deal with change, to deal with, excuse me, dynamics, to deal with exploration and exploitation, that you'd exploit your cash cows so that you could explore with your question marks and stars. Of course, this framework completely ignores any relatedness among businesses. It was, very flawed, but back in those days, CEOs needed something to give them an ability to deal with these dynamic issues. We become much better today as this dynamic capabilities view of the firm has really blossomed. And I'm not going to talk in detail about this. We've had Connie Helfat discussed it in two of these presentations. David Teese was in the first. They can do a much better job than I. So I refer you back to those presentations and to their other work on, as David calls it, sensing, seizing, and transforming. So I'm not going to talk about dynamic capabilities, but I will say a little bit about exploration and exploitation, which is, I think, very closely related to dynamic capabilities. It's a framework that I often think about. So Jim March had the classic insight here that firms in a changing environment need to do both of these to survive. They need to improve their existing businesses, and they also have to search for new businesses. So you need to have some balance between exploration and exploitation. Now, you can pursue, I think, both of these, I would argue, through either internal development or acquisition. And when you explore through internal development in an established multi-business firm, that's called ambidexterity. And we have some firms like Amazon that do this brilliantly, although it's very challenging. And I think it's safe to say that most firms end up doing their exploration through acquisition. But either way, you can explore, go into new business domains, and they're not mutually exclusive, as I'll show you in a minute. Amazon has explored through acquisitions, and exploitation. Again, Mike Porter would argue it's cost reduction, increasing differentiation, raising willingness to pay, and so on. Now, as I've just suggested, acquisitions can be used for both exploration and exploitation. I'm going to say just a little bit about a paper Gwen Lee and I published recently in Industrial and Corporate Change that builds on some of our prior work. Exploration, exploitation, and mode of market entry, acquisition versus internal development by Amazon and Alphabet. And in this paper, we basically consider our previous framework, which says that firms can use acquisitions or internal development to fill gaps in their primary business or to extend the domain of that business. Now, the Amazon Alphabet comparison, I think, is really interesting. Now, as I'll say in just a few minutes, as we've moved into this digital economy in the last 20 years, it's made things much more complicated and interesting, and really moved us away from that icing on the cake, the layer cake analogy. Amazon, in general, has emphasized entry through internal development, but it's had these domain extending acquisitions like Whole Foods, PillPack, Ring, Twitch Gaming, One Medical. And it's also had some gap filling acquisitions like recently MGM Studios, Kiva Systems. In some ways, though, Amazon is kind of conventional in the way it's used internal development and acquisition. Although it is unusual for such a big firm, now relatively mature, to continue doing so much through internal development. Alphabet is a really interesting case. It's made its entries primarily through acquisition, although it's, as I'll say in a minute, it's just kind of a hybrid between acquisition and internal development. And the moonshots, which are the really big domain extending things, are all through internal development. So it's kind of backwards of what you might normally expect. And Alphabet's acquired companies at nearly 3 times the rate of Amazon, although a lot of these are smaller companies. So if you look in terms of value, Alphabet's not been so much ahead of Amazon. And Google, the primary core business within Alphabet, the acquisitions have often come in quick succession, integrating the acquired companies with each other and with Google's internal capabilities in a way that is perhaps unique, perhaps something that we might see more of as the world becomes more digital. I think that Google's only been able to do what it does here because it's not dealing with physical assets, it's dealing with digital assets. Just to give you some ideas here, if you think about Google's entry into Maps, they made 3 acquisitions very close together and integrated those internally with their internal capabilities. Android was 2 acquisitions made together, shortly followed by a third, again, integrated with the internal capabilities. Both very successful. They've been less successful with some other things. They tried entering robotics with 10 acquisitions at the same time, ultimately failed. They tried entering social networking, again with multiple acquisitions, connecting them together, failed. Facebook just had too much power here. All right. So much for that topic. Let me move on to industry life cycles. The idea that there's going to be a life cycle in the industry and even life cycle of assets. Now we've had the corporate master class on mergers and acquisitions, the corporate strategy master class on divestments. In that divestments master class, Emily points out, as well as in her other work, that divestment used to be considered kind of an afterthought. The real action here was mergers and acquisitions, but divestments, at least in terms of value, are almost as important as acquisitions. So we do see, as Porter said, found in his study, firms acquire and then they divest. Asim points out that the divestment could either come from life cycle issues or from failure of acquisitions, basically uncertainty. So I refer you to those. Connie, in her master class, talked about Johnson & Johnson and IBM, this patching idea of Eisenhart and Brown, basically swapping out, changing businesses. So I'll refer you to those life cycle issues. Now, resource redeployment is something that I've been involved with. It really started with this paper by Helfet and Eisenhart, and I'll quote you from Connie's masterclass. Resource redeployment refers to the partial or full removal of resources and or capabilities from one business and their deployment in another business within the firm. So we've got here what is not static economies of scope, but intertemporal economies of scope, sharing over time. And Tim gave a nice presentation on a strategic redeployment. Resource redeployment has been a major topic area of Tim's. Teresa, our host here, is student of Tim's. Done a tremendous amount of work there. Arkady Sakratov, again, major contributor here. This resource redeployment area has become a very active topic area within corporate strategy. I'll just say, just very briefly, I have a joint paper with Tim and Gwen Lee on exit entry and the potential for resource redeployment. And without going through this in any detail, it's really about new business entry as experimentation and learning under uncertainty within established firms. That an established firm, if it does this sort of thing well, basically choosing to enter businesses where the resources can be redeployed and pulling the plug quickly when it's clear that the new business is failing, it can enter businesses even when the expected profit is negative. So it's a very powerful idea, I think, that firms like Amazon are able to implement. I'm running out of time, so let me just go to the last topic area, platforms and ecosystems. So here we have the role of complements. Teresa mentioned that Ron Adner is going to talk about this next time. So I'll be very brief here, but essentially we've got now, when we get into platforms and ecosystems, economies of scope on the demand side, as well as on the supply side, as well as I said, over time. So we've got now multiple dimensions of economies of scope, well beyond what we were originally thinking about in our field. These slides I stole from Ron, so I'll really let him talk about this next time. But my main point here is that we have actors in an ecosystem who are cooperating to create value and then competing to capture value. Now, we also have an IG on cooperative strategies. So I think these days, a lot of these boundaries are becoming very blurred. This type of cooperative strategy here is a different kind of alliance from what has conventionally been considered. And again, there's the question of what exactly do we mean by the scope of the firm when we're in this kind of an ecosystem context. We've got, again, the supply chain where, vertical integration, we've studied that, but now we've got these ecosystems. We've got platform, multi-sided platforms as well as product ecosystems. So it's a really interesting thing. I'm sure Ron will talk a bit about this. And now we're just completely worlds apart from this icing on the cake metaphor, which, to be honest, I still hear Mike Porter's voice in my ear that corporate strategy about icing on the cake, but that's not true anymore. I mean, one thing I learned in putting this presentation together is that we've moved far beyond this icing on the cake idea, that we have a much richer and more complicated view as the firm is an evolving organic system with all of these conceptions that I have on the right-hand side that people are exploring in really exciting ways. And so I think that today, I would have to say that corporate strategy is where the action is in terms of a lot of very exciting things going on. So let me stop there and turn this over back to Teresa.
Thank you very much, Marvin. This was incredibly enlightening. I think, Javier, if you're ready, I don't want to take away any time from you, and I would just pass it over to you right away.
I need to unmute, so beginner's mistake. And then I want to make sure that you can see the slides, okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Very good. All right. So thank you very much for inviting me for this presentation. I would say a little bit like Marvin, I consider myself more of a competitive strategy person than a corporate strategy. Although really this has, the topic of this meeting really has been very key to a lot of my own research. So you mentioned how some of my early work on multi-market contact tried to explore this. So what I would like to do a little bit like Marvin is set up the stage. I'm going to be maybe less positive than Marvin on the state of intersection. I would say we are still kind of living in worlds apart, but I will discuss some areas where I think we have made some progress, or we can make more progress. And I will leverage my own work just because this is what I know better, right? So not only my work, but clearly, as you will see, a lot of the work that I've done with PhD students on exploring this space. So every time that there is a categorization or classification system, there is an opportunity to get lost and to observe different gaps in the phenomenon, right? And clearly the corporate strategy versus business strategy or competitive strategy is one of the earliest distinctions in the field of strategy. And as a consequence, there has been a tendency for people to classify themselves as being either corporate or business or competitive strategy people, and because of that, using tools or asking questions in a way that is relevant to them and their communities, but may not necessarily give us the big picture. By the way, it would be interesting to do the same between strategy content and strategy process, right? Because it's a similar divide within the field. Now, like Marvin, I kind of looked at some of the reference or the kind of the definitions of these topic concepts coming from Purdue. I looked at the Schendel and Hofer 78 book, and basically the way they describe a corporate strategy is what businesses should we be in, and competitive strategy, how should a firm compete in a given business. So I think this already sets a very clear modular view of corporate versus business or competitive strategy, where the emphasis on corporate strategy is on the business scope, the portfolio of businesses. Not only that, also about how to manage the interdependencies between the businesses, and then the performance outcome. So Marvin alluded to the research about how much of the performance is explained by industry, competitive advantage, and corporate advantages. Now, in contrast, competitive strategy traditionally has focused on within business decisions. So things about differentiation, low cost, positioning, competitive aggressiveness. So a lot of the research in a way connects to some of the topics on business economics and trying to influence a performance outcome. Now, for me, the bigger distinction is what is the way to assess to ask the question, right? In corporate strategy, typically the way we think of advantage is advantage in value creation relative to other ownership forms. So you could think about this as parenting advantage. And because of this, it is highly connected to topics such as corporate governance. In fact, until a few years ago, at the SMS, the corporate strategy division and the corporate governance division used to be one division, right? So, and that's because you have to deal with issues about ownership, engagement with shareholders, and so on. While in competitive strategy, the way we typically evaluate value creation is relative to other competitors or other options in the market competing for whatever customers you have. So the idea of competitive advantage. Now, I think those have evolved or have broadened. So as Marvin mentioned, within corporate strategy, we are now looking a lot more on issues of scope dynamics, portfolio dynamics. So you can use multiple labels: stretch versus leverage, efficiency versus renewal, exploration versus exploitation. And I would say within competitive strategy, similarly, there has been a lot of focus on going from the industry level of competition to the strategic groups, and then specific firm level interactions, right? So a lot of work on competitive dynamics, competitive interdependence, how does that limit your ability to capture value, and so on. Now, I do think that these divisions are still very relevant, because when I look at a lot of the work on corporate strategy, I ask myself, but where are the competitors? Where are the rivals, right? Because a lot of the analysis is maybe dynamic, but does not specifically tell us to what extent other competitors of these business units have similar or different portfolio of businesses or ways of managing the interdependencies within the businesses. And as a consequence, it is hard to talk about the competitive advantage of corporate strategy, right? So unless we are able to kind of come down to the competitive strategy level. Similarly, when you look at the competitive strategy, one of the weaknesses of that research is that it tends to assume firms as unitary actors, competing within the business or within the industry, but it tends to abstract away from two important factors that corporate strategy brings. One is that there may be things on the scope of the organization outside the focal industry or business that impacts the way the organization works. And second, the issues of internal organization. So within the corporate strategy, you have incentives, you have internal governance systems, which supposedly allow you to manage this business better than other owners. But this is a dimension, the internal organization, that is missing really within the competitive strategy. Now, as Marvin mentioned, I think some of the frameworks that at least influenced my entry into the field. So I'm a little bit kind of younger than Marvin in terms of our entry, but I think we were very much inspired by some of the same literatures. I would say the first attempt to try to make these connections was the work by Porter, both in the 1985 book, where he specifically has several chapters looking at how interrelationships between businesses can influence competitive strategy in terms of tangible, intangible linkages, but also very important competitive linkages. So what happens where you are competing against other competitors that have similar scopes outside the focal business than you have, right? And at that time, for example, there was the time where AT&T was moving from telecommunications into computers. IBM was moving from computers into telecommunications. So you had this emergence, well, in fact, not really emergent, this evidence of multi-market competition or multi-point competition, where same competitors would be overlapping in multiple markets. And now the question is, how does that affect the way they compete? I mentioned there the paper by Karnani and Warnerfeld. I mean, if you look at the literature back then, it was a collection of mini cases, kind of theoretical frameworks, very little empirical evidence of that. Now, the paper by Porter, the HBR, really starts with a clear reference point, which I agree, that successful corporate strategy must grow out of and reinforce competitive strategy. So if your corporate strategy does not improve your competitive strategy, it's not clear how this is going to help. Now, another literature that already started to bring this in connection is the literature, the early literature in the RBB, because as part of the discussion of the factor market, they understood that if you have sources of competitive success that other competitors can easily buy or imitate, then that should not be a distinctive, a source of distinctive sustainable competitive advantage. So this brings, for example, the issues of private synergy, right? So when you look at a potential target for acquisition, you should not just look at whether you can create value relative to the standalone value of the firm, but also potential other acquirers, right? Because that is going to affect the bidding, or the what often is called the best owner test, right? So am I the best parent, the best owner for this business? But I would say in general, the literature has, or corporate strategy at least, has not really embedded this point of reference of what are other competitors doing. They tend to be more about corporate evolution, corporate dynamics, but not necessarily bringing in this kind of external comparative perspective. Now, one way to potentially go about integrating the corporate strategy dimension into a competitive strategy framework is to use like a two-stage type of game, right? So this is usually the way I would think about kind of strategy decisions, right? So you make choices, but and your choices can have an impact on your performance in two ways. So one is through value creation, either increasing willingness to pay or reducing costs. But the second is going to have an impact on your competitive behavior. Now, your competitors would also make strategic choices. Now, if those strategic choices are also get them to create value, that means that your added value is no longer great, so that is actually bad for you. You don't want to compete with other competitors that are very good at relative efficiency. But then you also can think about how those choices of the competitor will affect their competitive behavior and how that will interact. So let's say one way to think about this is that you can think about how your corporate strategy choices affect value creation, but then the intensity of rivalry and the value capture context that determines whether the efficiencies that you create through your corporate strategy are appropriated by the customers or the suppliers or somebody else, or are actually captured by your shareholders. So this is a framework that we can think of to look at two dimensions of corporate strategy. One would be things like corporate scope. The other would be things about corporate management and internal governance. And I will make some references to my own research. So let me start with the multi-market scope. So my dissertation was on this topic. So for me, the big question at that time was that the competitive strategy research at that time really abstracted from any similarities that companies would have outside the focal market or industry or analysis. Now, they would, in corporate strategy, of course, there will be, as Marvin mentioned, some focus on the multi-market efficiencies due to relatedness, synergies, and economies of scope. But my big question was, well, if economies of scope are so important, then other competitors also experience them. What happens if they are no longer proprietary? What happens if other rivals may also benefit from similar economies of scope? So, for example, if you look at Coke and Pepsi, they have many products that compete head-to-head with one another. Now, they are able to get into markets because of the bottling network, the distribution network. Now, those are big barriers to entry, so not many other companies can compete with other products. But what you see is a high level of overlap in terms of the product market offers. What happens if these rents are shared? So the paradox, and I explored this in one of my first papers out of the dissertation, was that if business or markets have strong linkages or synergies, then it's likely that competitors that are present in one market are also likely to be present in the other. So multiple competitors are likely to imitate such linkages. Number two, from an RBB or competitive advantage point of view, if competitors can benefit from similar linkages, then these synergies are no longer proprietary, and as a consequence, it's harder to capture the value. The value should go to somebody else. But the thing is that very often you see that companies that have these linkages had higher profits. What would that be? And one possibility was that if competitors also benefit from the multi-market contact, then that would affect the way they would compete. So their tendency towards value capture, i.e. they would do mutual forbearance, the intensity of rivalry would be less, and as a consequence, they would be able to appropriate or capture the benefits generated by the synergy rather than passing them along to customers. Now, another framework that can be used to looking at the same effect is by my current and former colleagues, Adner and Sensky. So they have a very interesting paper in strategy science where basically they say, well, how about if generating synergies actually requires a sunk cost? In that case, there will be only a limited number of companies that can diversify by leveraging some of those synergies. So at the end, there is a possibility to capture value through synergies, partly because there is only a limited number of players that can play this economics of scope game. But so an extension of this is that if competitors internalize the competitive effect, then what you might see is companies looking at their competitors' scope to decide to expand their own scope. So there is a well-known literature on our multi-market contact that provides evidence on this, also follow the leader. Marvin alluded to the digital conglomerates. I would love to see research, for example, looking at how the competitors' expansion into new markets influence their responses by other digital conglomerates. Because if you are competing against someone who is able to give products away for free because they are able to monetize, to subsidize themselves by other businesses, it's very hard to compete against free. And one tendency would be for these conglomerates to also enter into similar product markets. So you see huge multi-market contact among those digital conglomerates. Now, the same could be said for alliances in competitive strategy. So traditionally, we see alliances as ways to attract resources, share resources, gain knowledge. But what happens when rivals can also compete in the alliance factor market, right? So are your alliances better than those of your competitors? And in a paper, I explore two possibilities. So one is that you try to compete for the same partner. So what I call competition within the network. Another way would be you want to create countervailing partnerships, which would be leading eventually towards competition between networks or group versus group competition. So in a paper, I will move on this, but basically I try to explore how your strategy on alliances might be driven not just by the opportunities for knowledge acquisition, resource sharing, but also the portfolio of alliances of your competitors. That is the type of competitive perspective that I often find missing in the corporate strategy. Finally, very quickly, in terms of the other dimension that corporate strategy brings is focus on the corporate structure, incentives, the fact that you have multiple layers of managers that are delegated decisions about how to operate. So a manager of a business unit within a corporation acts very differently than an owner-operator of a pure player. And one of the things that I've been trying to explore is how does that affect a competitive strategy, competitive interactions. Now, let me jump over here. So a few examples of work on this. So for example, with one of my first PhD students here at INSEAD, Gover Room, now at IESE, we looked at the difference of competitive behavior. So here the focus was really pricing behavior on hotels based on whether they were corporate owned versus owner franchisee owned, right? And the idea there was that in a way, corporate rules of delegated decisions can become commitments for how to compete in the product market. What we found is that corporate owner hotel managers were more able to commit to high price discipline in concentrated markets. And as a consequence, they tended to benefit from higher performance in those markets. And in fact, talking to some of the hotel companies, we found that whenever there is concentrated markets, typically they will have a preference for having corporate-owned units in those markets rather than franchisees. Another one with Metin Sengel, another PhD student now at DC, is about multi-industry organizations and then how do they execute a multi-market competition, right? Because multi-market competition, the competitive decisions are delegated to the business unit manager. And as a consequence, how do the corporate headquarters influence or constrain the range of competitive behaviors that these unit managers can do? And what we found is that when subsidiaries face multi-market rivals, they were constrained by the headquarters in different ways. Number one, they have less discretion on setting the objectives that they could compete. So it was headquarters that would drive the objectives rather than the subsidiary. In a way, to constrain them, there would be less discretion of investment decisions. So they would be limited in terms of the purse. And finally, they would be given less financial subsidies when those basically had low market share or high industry growth. This is super interesting because this is precisely the opposite of what the BCG model would predict, which is that if you have a low market share or high growth industry, those are the ones that you want to subsidize. When these subsidiaries face multi-market contact, basically the level of subsidization was reduced. Okay, I will skip some of the other examples, but you can also think of this in terms of financial constraints. So typically organizations face financial constraints and capital market constraints at the corporate level, but it's interesting to see how those translate at the business unit level in terms of the intensity of competition, output, prices, performance, and so on. So I want to finish with two takeaways. So first of all, if you are a traditional corporate strategy person, please bring competitive rivals back in. So think about how the corporate advantage might be replicated by rivals. Is your corporate advantage unique relative to rivals? Look at the competition at the corporate scope level. And on the other hand, if you are more of a traditional competitive strategy, my claim would be open up the box of the internal organization. So explore how the corporate scope differences of these businesses might affect the way they compete, but also things like corporate structure, the delegation, incentives, or corporate constraints. How do they shape, maybe enhance, maybe constrain the competitive behaviors and outcomes? Okay, so this is my pitch. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Javier. That was great. Wow, that opens up a room for the Q&A session now. In fact, we have a couple of questions in the chat. I think maybe Marvin has had the time to look at some of them already. If you like, feel free to choose any, or I can also start us off with a couple of questions, whatever you prefer. If there's anything you feel like you want to answer right away, feel free. Otherwise, I can start.
Yeah, let me just address one issue, I think the first one in the chat, which led me to believe that maybe I was being a little too high level in what I was saying about the intersection. Let me just reinforce the idea that, I mean, it used to be that in competitive strategy, we could analyze the business unit's resources and capabilities, its competitive advantage through cost or differentiation, and then think about the corporate strategy issues. And what I'm saying is that now corporate strategy is so closely interlinked with business strategy, especially in these companies like Amazon and Alphabet, that we can't really even think about the corporate strategy questions independent of the competitive strategy questions independent of the corporate strategy issues. So I mean, the main takeaway from my talk is in some ways that these distinctions are becoming really increasingly blurred.
Thank you. Maybe I'll sort of pick up on that right away. Both of you have mentioned corporate flexibility, or in a way corporate advantage, and something that could be replicated potentially by rivals, and considering that. So for example, Marvin, you've talked about the metaphor of this revolving door that firms like maybe Amazon or Alphabet could flexibly enter a market and then leave again at relatively low costs, and that this could be beneficial also in a way for competitive strategies. So I was wondering, but is that type of flexibility always beneficial? I mean, you've talked about icing on the cake and things like that. Or is it, if we think about what Javier said, that if rivals actually realize that you are a flexible firm, that they might not only even try to replicate what you're doing, but that they actually actively try maybe to push you out of a market? That they not only use a similar revolving door, but sort of use this flexibility potentially against you.
Let me just mention, we have in strategy this fundamental question of when to be flexible and when to commit. So this flexibility versus commitment choice is really key, and I think it speaks to the question that you're raising, Teresa. There are times when flexibility is really valuable, and there are times when commitment, basically, sinking use another ship analogy, sinking your ships so as to motivate your troops and deter rivals. That can also be very valuable. So it's a question beyond the issues we've been talking about today, but it's another whole stream of research and strategy that's really interesting and important.
So if I may jump on this, Teresa, I think one interesting angle on that would be, what is the right level of analysis to look at these issues of preemption, right? Because if you have flexible resources that you can allocate among markets, then the market itself becomes contestable. But there may be high sunk costs of having the resources that give you that flexibility. And maybe it's at that level that you want to think about, okay, how many companies have the resources to play this game, right? Now, I would say one of the dark sides of economies of scope or kind of resource sharing when you are in a competitive context is that they can also become barriers to exit, right? In the sense that, as you know, I look at a lot of the airline industry, and then you have the hub and spoke systems. The more spokes you add to the hub and spoke system, the more revenue opportunities you create. But if you have other competitors that create those many similar network patterns, it's very hard to then start cutting businesses, because if you cut, suddenly your revenue decrease is much higher than the cost decrease that you can get. So let's say when you are competing with high interdependencies across business, suddenly the level of preemption shifts from the individual market to the network of business type of level.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if I can comment quickly, Javier, you mentioned Coke and Pepsi as two firms that were able to imitate each other, and oftentimes imitation, can be a problem, can drag them down. But in the Coke and Pepsi case, we know from teaching the case that those two firms actually strengthened each other and were able to deter other firms. So I think it has an analog today. The big tech companies have the ability to imitate each other, and arguably they are now creating barriers to entry to smaller players. And maybe at some point we need to replace Coke and Pepsi, or at least add to it with Amazon and Microsoft and Google, and at least talk about that if we're going to teach the Coke and Pepsi case.
Exactly, and the question is how many companies can afford to have the portfolio of business to become the data conglomerates that allows them to be simultaneously on all of the businesses. So being a single market business in a context like that is super difficult when you are competing with the Googles, Microsoft, Apples of the world, right?
Right, and we see that with AI. There are only a few big players who are able to be developing these.
Yep.
So one of the questions actually coming in even in advance of your talks was, how does technology, and in that case maybe AI, change a discussion around the intersection of corporate strategy and competitive strategy? And I think from what we've learned today, we could say that it maybe intertwines them even more intensively. That probably also makes things even more complicated. But maybe you want to elaborate on this a little bit more. I know we don't want to go too much over time, but maybe this could be a final.
So two things is like any other thing is a source of resource sharing. But I think what is important, is interesting, is that with the digital AI, you have different monetization strategies, which means that you can enter a business without making money there because you make money somewhere else. From a competitive point of view, that makes it very hard for you to just compete in one market without being in the other. So my prediction is that this is going to become huge level of multi-market contact and really competition at that higher level.
Yeah. And as I suggested, this digital age with the platforms and ecosystems, which has been the last 20, 25 years or so, is really different from what came before. I mean, what Johnson Johnson and DuPont and GE and others did. I mean, I think the layer cake analogy was relevant then, but what we're seeing today with digital competition platforms is really quite different. And I know we're running out of time, but Ron Adner is doing the next one of these, and maybe Ron is really a student of technology, so maybe Ron can address these in greater detail.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll learn much more about this in the masterclass he's going to lead in the future. But definitely I still want to take the chance. If there are any last questions, I don't know, you want to pick out of the chat, or if there's anything maybe having in mind. There are always also a lot of PhD students in the audience that might look for guidance on their thesis. If there's anything, I know, especially Javier, you had this last slide where you're kind of saying, well, if you're a corporate strategy person, I would suggest you do this. If you're a competitive strategy person, or you consider yourself a competitive strategy person, maybe you want to do this. Is there anything, you basically want to tell the PhD students in the audience?
But it was an interesting field when I entered it, in the 1980s, and it's an even more interesting field today. So I think find questions that really are tractable, but that you want to invest in your time in trying to figure out. There is, the structure with these IGs and these distinctions that we make, I think that's useful. There is some concern that the field has become fairly balkanized, but I think a lot of what we're talking about today is that there are so many interconnections across those towers that Javier said I'm more optimistic. My wife says I'm always an optimist, but I do think that the field is really a very interesting place to work, and just find questions that excite you.
I would say focus on the intersections. So just like the title of the session, those tend to be things that we tend to ignore, right? Because of the way we identify into particular communities. So any research on this intersection would be interesting research.
Well, that's a very, I think, optimistic and positive note to end on. Let me say thank you again so much for leading this incredibly interesting masterclass. This was really a blast. I'm sure, I'm definitely available if there are any questions after the masterclass, and I could imagine you would be available as well in case anybody has really pressing questions still, but I'm afraid we'll have to end it now and take any other questions offline. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.